Hello. I'd like to welcome you to the third in the series of Miami Do You Love Me lectures as part of the new two-year non-residential Doctor of Design program at FIU. The first session was about Mar-a-Lago and given by John Stewart. The second session was about Zaha in Miami and given by Patrick Schumacher, Claudia Bush, and John Stewart again. This third session expands upon that second session and looks at the broader aspect of the contemporary architecture of Miami. And Miami has become a real hotspot for contemporary architecture over the past few years. Not only do we have Zaha's building, the building design by Zaha, the architects, opening last year in Miami, but a number of other very prominent architects have been involved in designing buildings in Miami. Most notably, perhaps, Herzog de Meuron, who are currently completing another tower block by the beach, and who designed a number of buildings, including possibly the world's most glamorous parking structure. So too, we've had buildings by Frank Gehry, by OMA, by Big, and so on. So I'm delighted today to be able to welcome two of my colleagues, Jason Chandler and Nick Gelpi, who are going to talk about contemporary architecture of Miami, what exactly is going on, and perhaps why. Well, why has Miami become such a mecca, such a hotspot for contemporary architecture? Jason Chandler, I should say, was instrumental in setting this program up. He put an enormous amount of effort into doing so, and I'm very grateful for the support that Jason has given us. Jason is a graduate of Cornell and the GSD and has his own practice here in Miami, and he is the chair of architecture at the School of Architecture at the Florida International University. I'd also like to welcome Nick Gelpi, one of my colleagues also at FIU. Nick is himself has graduated from Columbia, where he was a TA for Carl Chu. He subsequently went on to teach at MIT and has now become a tenured professor at FIU. Over to you, Jason.
Okay, thank you, Neil. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I'm going to reshare in a second. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm very pleased to have a chance in this opportunity, and I thank Neil for asking us to do this because it's given me an opportunity to sort of reflect on Miami. I will say this is an interesting moment. I can say that I've lived exactly half my life in Miami, 26 years this year. So. While I cannot say I am a sort of full-blown Miamian, having been here long enough, having my daughters who are true Miamians, having been born here and lived here all their lives, I do represent the group that we're probably going to talk about the most today, which is people that come to this city. And I sort of loosely entitle this Miami the Frontier City because of that. So I begin with this quote. I don't know if Dave Barry is an international name, but he's certainly a humorist and Pulitzer-winning columnist. And his quote, which he said many different times in many different ways, "I moved to Miami in 1986 from the United States," which is a loaded statement. It's meant to be humorous, but I think it speaks to a lot about Miami's identity and who's looking at it. So I think he's probably reflecting, in a way, the sort of xenophobia that is present whenever one talks about places that are somehow not in sync with the rest of the country. But I also think he's, in a hopeful way, is talking about how unique Miami is in so many ways. It is at a peninsula we're at the end of a long peninsula. So while we are very much in the United States, and one could argue that the recent history of politics has certainly revolved, or at least hovered, over the state of Florida, and the contingency of interest from Miami is certainly part of that national story. But I do think the point here is This is a person who has been here for a long time, but obviously is from someplace else, and has a mixed reaction, or I guess affair with Miami. So the place, I think, just to speak very simply about Miami as a place, and this may be very obvious, but it is a place of extraordinary flatness, combined just in terms of this quick plan. It is, you can see, and everyone, this is sort of a view from the landing or taking off in Miami. It is this thing that is a bizarre city, because it is a city that is rising, both in architecture and in also sea level. And when you sort of fly in and out of it, you can't help but think that the civilization is just literally painted on on the ocean. It just sort of sits there as a differentiation of color, and out of it is this metropolis that has been growing. So it has a kind of extraordinary presence as a thing. It's been said about it, it is also in a way a dream for builders. Its flatness makes for sort of very ready-made sites. You don't have to worry about slope. You do have to worry about sea level rise and water, but in a way, it really is a developer's dream. Large, vast tracts of land, relatively inexpensive, with a water view, has provided what you're looking at here. The other point of this is you're also looking at a kind of geological condition of the granite shelf that sort of runs north and south along the eastern coast of the Florida border, and that's why you get these nice, big, strong concrete buildings resting on, actually, in spite of its closeness to the water, really substantial ground, oddly enough. So having Neil ask, the question of, please talk about contemporary architecture, I had to pick a moment in time to begin. And this little lecture will probably leave a lot of things out, but I hope addresses the contemporary situation. And I pick 1983 as the moment where one could argue that there is a start of contemporary thinking about art and architecture. And it's an odd pair, or I guess triplet rather. And it is a moment of arrival for Jean-Claude and Christo, and the sort of infamous Philip Johnson. And they both come in, and I like this image of Jean-Claude and Christo walking on the beach, sort of not dressed appropriately for the beach, rolling up their long pants, kicking off their shoes, and arriving to this extraordinary landscape. And of course, we'll talk a lot about what Philip Johnson brings to Miami. Here he is on the cover of Time magazine in a kind of hero pose, here to save the day and usher in a new architecture, particularly US architects. So Jean-Claude, they, and I'm sure you all know this world famous installation, Surrounded Islands, conceived of by Jean-Claude, executed together. An extraordinary story, and I would recommend, there's a very nice documentary on this project. The museum, the Perez Art Museum that Neil mentioned, just held a retrospective of this moment. And I think you can argue it many different ways, but I think it is an extraordinary project, and one of the tensions that it brings in contrast to Philip Johnson's ideas of architecture, I believe it is a true critical piece, one that is bound in the place of Miami, its geography, its obviously hydrography, its landscape, its vegetation, water. It relies on all the things that make it unique. And I think the work of Jean-Claude and Christo, the tension that they produce is is whenever they make that installation, the lens of observation, the sort of view of the place that they are engaging becomes all the more heightened, right? So whether it's covering the Reichstag or the Pont Neuf, and the Pont Neuf was a project they were doing with this, obviously the idea of covering and hiding something makes the thing itself more present. And I think that is what they're doing here with the landscape. An extraordinary piece, because oddly enough, it was in a way inaccessible. You really had to be in an airplane to really appreciate it. And it was also, I think, in a way, a very contemporary piece because it relied on media. It was actually very hard to see unless you were in a skyscraper. If you drove by and if you were a lowly pedestrian living in Miami, walking around, you would barely see it. It was there for 11 days. It was a blink, you don't miss it. But it is an extraordinary tale of a city going out of its way to engage the contemporary art scene to produce what we call here an art in public place. And I think this moment really is the beginning of Miami stepping onto the stage of the conversation, the world conversation about art. At the same time, Philip Johnson completes the Miami Cultural Arts Center. And this is one of those things that is I would argue a kind of mixed blessing, because this is, in a way, and he's not the first, but he is certainly one of the earliest star architects that comes to Miami to import or to certify Miami's identity with a building. And does so in, one can argue this, I think, in many different ways, but I would say does so in a kind of clumsy way, right? Assumes, which is one of the kind of narratives of Miami, that it is this new Spain, or you could, some kind of Mediterranean dream, because it's a peninsula and it's surrounded by water. And this is something inherited from George Merrick. Different people, developers from the 20s had done these things, and basically import an architecture to the place to say, this is what you are. This is a building that has been criticized and I would say not loved. It is also, very interestingly, the first home of the Miami Art Museum, which becomes the Perez Art Museum, which we will talk about toward the end. So it is, and I can remember coming up to this building when I got here and being very dismayed about it for any number of reasons. It's an elevated plaza, it doesn't engage the public, and it is, we could argue, a series of clumsy, hammy details, cartoon of a building as opposed to anything real. But nonetheless, he comes and he brings with him architect as brand, something that he, as you know, championed the idea of the Starchitect, the idea that this is a thing, a commodity, and it itself is a value and maybe the highest version of architecture. So this is the very famous photo of Philip at his 90th birthday. And it kind of curious photo because it could be also a photo of Miami. And I say that because 10 of the architects in this photo have built in Miami and have done so with a level of celebrity. Also, maybe not so much. There was a point where Miami was a place where architects were doing their worst buildings. I'd like to think that's changed, but they're here. So I'll just go through it quickly, but Michael Graves does a building early. Zaha, which you've talked about, which talked about last week. Arata Zizaki, Philip himself, Richard Meyer, Rem Koolhaus, who we'll talk about a little bit more about his relation to Miami, Frank Gehry, Charles Gwathmey, and then this character, this rakish curatorial hawk sitting in the back, watching all of us, Terry Riley, who we will also talk about as, I would argue, an important force in the Miami scene. But there it is. Not something that I would normally have thought would be a picture of Miami, but one that I think you'll see plays itself out importantly. So I just took a few of these just to talk about their work. Izusaki, who has had a protracted relationship with Miami, with the Bass Art Museum, does, in addition to an existing Coral Rock, what was formerly a library, and turns it into a contemporary art museum, comes back, excuse me, several years later to renovate it. So I think over a 10, 15-year period is working on this project in Miami. Frank Gehry, I can give you a sidebar, very interesting story. This is his New World Center for the Arts. And the famous story of this building is that the client, Michael Tilson Thomas, the conductor, was a, excuse me, one of the people that Frank Gehry babysat as a young individual, which is sort of extraordinary. And Michael Tilson Thomas reaches out to him to build this building. A very interesting building in his oeuvre. It is a kind of reverse of his typical building, which, if you think of Bilbao as a series of accumulation of objects coming together to form a whole, this is the reverse. It's a box with a series of objects embedded inside it. So you could attribute this to the hurricane codes and the strength of a building envelope that's needed to kind of put a building up. And I think, in a way, a very intelligent project for a public, and actually a great public space with a big wall cast on it. So really, actually extraordinary public space for Miami Beach. West 8 does the plaza in front of it. Richard Meyer, who actually came to Florida much sooner than this. He did it in the 80s, a house in Palm Beach, but comes down recently and does the Surf Club, a super luxury, actually rather extraordinary, well-built Meyer building on the beach. Zaha, which we've all talked about, has a series of projects. The most celebrated is the 1000 Museum Tower, which we've talked about, which I always say is a kind of curious building. Not skyscrapers, I don't typically, or at least developer skyscrapers aren't typically the object of affection, but this building has, for many reasons that was talked about last week, but certainly her personality, having a female architect building with such prominence on there, I think really is a building we all really admire and love. Not in the photo, but also I think important, Renzo Piano, another Pritzker Prize winner, comes down just recently, finishing 87 Park, a sort of simple, sort of boat-like piece, sort of cruise ship sitting on the water there, just recently completed. But I do want to talk about Terry Riley and his role, because he is a kind of transitional figure. He's interesting because he does move to Miami. So I don't know how long he's been here, but he's probably been here for at least 15, maybe even 20 years. And does a series of projects and acts in the curatorial way. If you remember, he was the former curator of architecture for Museum of Modern Art, and brings that curatorial eye and skill to Miami, principally for the Perez Art Museum, which we'll talk about later, but does so after that in this parking garage, which is a collage of architects, and speaks to this idea of brand and the commercialization of architecture in Miami. So it's he calls it an exquisite corpse, like the Strada Novissimo at the Venice Biennale from the 80s, which is this collection of postmodern architects that sort of share this fictive road, street, and produce this cacophony of architectures that one might argue go together because of a general sensibility, but I think also resist each other through that same sensibility, and produce this collage. And he does this for a parking garage for the design district, which I'm going to present as a next step in Miami's architecture, where it's really brand has taken over and the architect almost in a way kind of vanishes from the scene. So these architects, this is Work AC, Jürgen Meyer, Clavel Architects, Nicholas Boeuf, and Keenan Riley, Terry's own firm. And they each basically were given a section of the facade in which to design without knowledge of whoever was next to them, but they understood that another architect would do that. And it was simply, a pure, as I say, cosmetic skin job, though some of the proposals do invade the building itself. But they sit, abutted, one against each other. And it's a kind of, you get what you get when it gets completed. And it produces, what I argue, a commercial excess, a kind of extravaganza of form and styles, colors, and shapes that speak to, I think, the sort of other component that is Miami and can't be ignored, and that's simply the service of brand and its presence in Miami. So one thing that is quite interesting, we have something called the Miami Art Design District, which was developed by Craig Robbins beginning in 2011. A very interesting developer project. It is, for all intensive purposes, a mall, but an outdoor mall that reorganizes the city. It's actually laid out by the new urbanist architects, Duane Plater-Zyberg, and it basically presents the idea that commercialism, shopping, a mall can essentially take over a piece of the city. It's not like the traditional American mall, which is away from the city, surrounded by a parking lot. It is the city redesigned as store. So this is just a sampling of the different types of brands that are there. And what's interesting about this, that each brand gets a little facade, a little building, and they sit just like Riley's parking garage, abutting one against each other. And you get the sort of collisions and contrasts that are unexpected and maybe curated probably at one point somewhere, but sort of one world coexists with another, and they're very clear about their own identity. But they produce some sort of extraordinary things, and I present this because it really brings a set of architects to Miami that you would, in a way, almost not believe that that's what's going on here. And when you walk in here, you are clearly dominated by the brand itself. This is, again, luxury goods. People come in here to be seen, to spend money, to associate their wealth with some kind of luxury brand. So this is the Alexander McQueen store, recently completed by an extraordinary building, but it is a combination, and I would say its authorship is between the design director, Sandra Burton, and the architect, Slimjan Radic, the Chilean architect who is notoriously monk-like and not one that is really out in the public sphere, and in a way you could argue even sort of resists the commercialism of architecture. But there he is, he's sitting in Miami. He has no other building in North America. He very infrequently ventures out of his home country, but here he is sitting at an American mall in the service of a brand, which is extraordinary. Across the way, we have Celine, and Celine, again, Hedi Slimane and Valerio Oligati, also notoriously monk-like in his presence, is doing a store, which I think famously he said he would never do again. But so you have, Oligati and Radic sitting, steps away from one another in this commercial heaven, you would say. Down the road, a few more steps, we have Valentino, a flagship store in Miami, and this is Pier Paolo Piccoli and David Chipperfield bringing this brand to the design district. Just a thought on this is a kind of sort of little Manhattan, a little vertical tower, a kind of a chunk of the the New York store dropped in Miami for all to see. And then last but not least, Off-White comes to town. Very young, dynamic architect Virgil Abloh and Rem Koolhaas. So if that's not enough of a kind of jarring collision of personalities and types and work, I don't know what is. But there it is. It's all there for your shopping pleasure, and all conveniently located one against each other. I will take a moment because to talk about Rem Koolhaas. His is a protracted relationship with Miami, which is, I think, quite interesting. And I would say really embeds, it is embedded in his career, and not really an anomaly. I think quite interestingly, one has to think, because of the sort of time in which he has engaged the city, many decades, has thought about it. And one could even argue that somehow Miami's commercialism may have trickled into his thesis of shopping, which he does with Prada. But he begins his work with this house, which is done in collaboration with Linda Spear, one of the partners of Arquitectonica, a very prominent Miami firm. This is the famous Pink House of the early 80s. And a very interesting building. And the rendering here, it really speaks to, I would say, a critical building that is looking at place, much like Christo, as opposed to an import. Though he does kind of straddle both of these lines. He is obviously a starchitect, you could say. And it's this collage, which I think also has some kind of continuities with the Strada Novissimo that we saw, that Riley is looking at it. So in a way, very much embedded in its time as it relates to the currents of postmodernism of the early 80s, but also one could say is also about the place, right? Looking at landscape, both in terms of vegetation and the water. And then here it's two pictures of it. And I think the collage of the images, obviously the colors, you could argue these are cartoonish, but nonetheless, these bright colors have been vehicles of Miamiism, and certainly in the eyes of Arquitectonica, the architects that, in combination with the TV show Miami Vice, essentially telegraphed to the world a certain version of Miami. And it's a house for her parents, so there is also this relationship of these kind of sort of international families coming, snowbirds, the idea that Miami is this sort of resort town, a place of escapism, and maybe not really quite a real place. He comes back, and to quote him, to an experience, an almost Kafka-like experience for him. He is an invited architect for the Miami Performing Arts Center, which he does not win. But he pours a huge amount of energy in, and I think is quite an interesting building. It's early, this is the early 90s, and his idea, and you can see right in the middle, the little kind of mini version of his National Library, which he calls here a social collector, sitting between the two performance spaces. I think rather interesting building. What he does in this building, which maybe why he didn't win it, is he actually puts both of the performance spaces on one site. The actual program had given each performance space its own site across the street, and he thought that didn't make sense, so he does a much more compact, more vertical proposal, and then does a water park in the front, again presumably engaging the sort of lush aqueous landscape that is Miami, bringing it into the downtown. A very interesting project, not built. It does get built with less success by Cesar Pelli, and the two spaces are across the main streets, and it to this day remains a difficulty to cross both, to access both because of this big boulevard. He ends, he bringing up to the day, he completes a very interesting building, the Faina Arts District, which is actually a series of buildings. This is the main, the forum, which is the kind of public event space that can be leased out for parties, art shows, performances, the main building. And then there is another series of buildings, a parking garage in the end. It's really, I think, 3 buildings and a renovated series of buildings, all connected on the ground by a very large parking garage. Very interesting building. So kind of low scale urban building on the beach, but does sort of the things that we expect from Cool House, plays with and imports modernist vocabularies. In this case, Melnikoff's own house, which is, you know, a fusion of 2 forms with this grid facade, obviously inspiration for the facade of this one. And this is one of his domes, which he's been using at different times. I guess the earliest one is in the prison project, and then does one for Cornell University, and Miami has one too. So a very actually interesting project of his. And then this one, which is actually across the street from the big towers, is his Grove Park, which also one could make the argument is about architecture, modernist architecture, and his professed love for Mies van der Rohe. And he is unashamed about that love and has said it many times. He doesn't like Mies, he loves him. So we have these amoeba towers sitting in Miami, courtesy of Rem. So I've left out the big name because I think Miami, I think on its best day, is looking toward trying to be itself. And I think it's the projects, it's the Cristo project, the project that is about the place that has the greatest resonance, because it both exists at kind of international level as something of uniqueness, but also is critical about the place. And what I think is sort of extraordinary about it is Miami's landscape is quite unique and powerful. This is one of the, we call it a banyan tree, basically a ficus. This kind of muscular tree full of tendons. It actually has a very shallow root system. The tree itself grows horizontally and drops these, I don't know what they call them, roots, these sort of exterior roots, and produces these extraordinary spaces in it, which has great presence. That with this sort of hard horizontal world of the water really does define a unique environment and landscape for the city. And this is something that I'm going to add Terry Riley again here, is very aware of when he does his own house. He moves here, I guess, just in the early 2000. Yes.
2003.
And does this house, which I actually took this just a few days ago, which basically has been gobbled up by or devoured by Miami's landscape. Hot, humid, lots of sun. You plant something, it blooms, it grows aggressively, very fast, and has a tendency to overcome its structures. And I think this is quite an interesting building for Terry, because it is a building which I think speaks to his own roots and his own relationship with Philip Johnson, the sort of uber curator for architects. To the right is Johnson's Rockefeller Guest House, that is this courtyard house, townhouse embedded in Manhattan. And on the left is Terry's Tropical Paradise, which in many different iterations was presented as a sort of Miesian project, but I think ultimately, because of its materiality and its engagement with the landscape, really is very much a Miami project. And it's one that Jacques Herzog and Piers Art Museum had visited before they started building here and admired quite a bit and used as a typology for one of their smaller housing projects. Which brings me to Herzog de Meuron, which I think are and are extraordinary architects for Miami. And I would argue that after languishing in the saccharine worlds of, on the one hand, the hyper luxury commercialism of Prada, and on the other hand, the hypo macho engineered nationalism of the Bird's Nest, return to Miami and to their building research roots with a pair of remarkable structures, the 1111 parking garage and the Perez Art Museum. And this is an extraordinary building, which everyone knows about. But it is Miami, and also simultaneously a critical piece of modern architecture. And again, it's the combination of the Maison Domino with the car not stuck at the bottom at the pilotis, but invading the entire thing. So it is this kind of extraordinary raw structure. Miami is a concrete town. We've got lots of sand sitting right here. We have huge concrete plants. So it is a material of the place. And here, what I like about it, it's presented in its sort of most muscular form and unadorned. So celebrating the sort of materiality of the place. And while obviously a highly rationalized, abstracted thing, has a tendency to have I would say, a kind of geological inevitability about it on its site. Just sort of sits there, you know, as this kind of porous, extraordinarily open pavilion of, you know, not even a tower, but a kind of, I guess Altana would be what it is, to use the Italian term, sort of elevated porch. And I would say, in addition to that, it's also just, you know, a very sophisticated building. And what I find sort of amazing about it is how it vacillates between thinness and thickness. And what is quite nice about it is how it plays with the sort of visuals. So what and again, they are, you know, sort of working at the highest levels right now, but when you look at this thing, it plays perceptually with your eyes. And you have a tendency to look at this thing and sort of straighten it out, assume that the floor plates are sort of stacking on top of each other, but they don't. They shift ever so slightly, and those shifts perspectively make the shorter, shallow floors appear to actually be shallower than they really are because of the jutting of the floor plane. So they have a tendency to squash. They are low, but they look even lower. And then the larger ones push back and have a tendency to look taller. So there is this kind of visual compression and expansion and compression going on here, which is just, you know, pure sort of visual architecture for architects stuff going on. But it also is this building that introduces, and what you could argue, it's a parking garage, yes, or you could say it's a single family house with a ton of parking, which in a way is also a kind of very funny way of thinking about Miami, a very car-centered town. But it also has up here a garden, this kind of, you know, landscape, which is really an artificial one. This is at the roof of the building. This is done by Raymond Junkels, a local architect, a local landscape architect, and who himself says this is a garden on a life support system, because it is not embedded in the ground, it is floating up there. But this is the beginnings of Herzog's relationship to Miami, which is one that understands the materiality of the city and its landscape, and the resulting sort of robust quality that both of these things in combination do. And that, I think, is presented most forcefully and most beautifully in the Perez Art Museum that they did in 2003, which I will hand off to Nicholas Gelpi. But I will just say one thing about this building before I do that. When this opened, I came in on, this is just a personal aside, and I can't underestimate how important a building this is for the city. I would argue more important than 1111, even though not sort of internationally as well known, is I came in there, you enter the lobby, and my impression was that I had arrived to MoMA, but this MoMA was sitting on the water, and I could turn my eye, from the ticket booth and look at the sort of extraordinary blue, shiny water landscape of Miami and the extraordinary landscape of the building, and then kind of look back and be confident and happy to be in this impressive modern art institution in my hometown. And I this is a beloved building of mine, and one that I think, which is bizarre, these Swiss architects really know Miami very, very well. So with that, I will hand it off to my colleague, Professor Gelpi.
All right, thank you. That was great. And I'm sorry to take this away from you, Jason, because it's a fun one to speak about. I recently, nice to meet you all the students. I recently published a book called The Architecture of Full-Scale Mockups, in which I had the opportunity to really look in depth at the Perez Art Museum as a case study. And in particular, let's see here, to look at the use of mockups in the design of this architecture. And I would say this is how Herzog and de Meuron are able, this kind of explains how they're able to be, this pristine Swiss architecture from doing quality work here in Miami, where it is actually very difficult to build a kind of Swiss level of construction. But a few things I want to, and I would argue that, 1111, even the OMA projects, there's a real struggle with materiality because of our climate. Our climate is intense. The air is filled with salt. Metal rusts very easily. And so I want to take you some of the extraordinary measures that they had to go through to actually pull this off as a way of looking behind the scenes. And then in addition, I was going to follow it up with a house that I recently completed. I've now lived in Miami 9 years. Almost a quarter of my life. But I arrived while this building was still under construction, and I knew the photographer, one of the professional photographers who would go every week and document construction. And I had the opportunity to visit it and kind of witness it firsthand. Obviously, when this building first came out, everybody said, there's no building like this. In a way, they were right. They said there's no building like this here in Miami. For one thing, a little bit of history. Terry Riley, who Jason Chandler mentioned, was the director of the Miami Art Museum at the time, and he really brought in Herzog de Meuron to design this new museum. Their initial scheme was a tower, so actually it would have looked like a lower tower. But Terry is somewhat responsible for steering the project in this direction. It was going to be a kind of what they initially described as an icon for the city, a cultural icon. And Terry said, we have a lot of icons, and he kind of pushed them into a different direction. And what's remarkable about this building, what I love about it, which really reminds me of MoMA in New York, is the degree of outdoor space. You can visit the Perez Art Museum. You can basically be on a very large porch. They call it a very large wraparound porch in the shade. And I would say those are the things that are kind of necessary to really enjoy our climate and be outdoors. So you can actually visit the Perez without going to the gallery. I love to go there just to use the restaurant or to get coffee, in addition to see the great shows. But here you can see it is somewhat of a building that's suspended above the ground, right? This is right on the shore of Biscayne Bay. You see this kind of shade trellis structure up above. And I put a photo here of Paul Rudolph's umbrella house from Sarasota. There's I think there's an unmistakable reference to this here. And I think this, Jason, I forget, is this like a 1958 house or something like that? Something like that, right?
Yeah.
Part of the Sarasota school. But an amazing house, right? With this pool, it's about, the simple box and the pool and bathing the pool in light. And you have a similar kind of thing happening here. These are some of the details of the umbrella house, the slats and the shadows that come down. And you see actually at the Perez, these are slats of greenheart wood, a really native tropical wood to Guyana. that they ordinarily use for boat pilings and dock pilings and things like that. But you see it really lifted up above the ground. The parking is below, and the galleries are kind of suspended up in the air. One thing I'll say that this project has in common with 1111 Garage, which seems to make it seem like it's not of Miami, is Miami, it's really, as you saw in the design district, about these kind of storefronts and facades. And in a way, this is a building such as 1111, a building without a facade. And I can't verify this, I've heard this, and it's a good story. Jacques Herzog said, you know, when he comes to Miami, he likes to take his shirt off. So he wanted to make a building without a shirt. So there's no facade. Another clear reference are a settlement of buildings out in Biscayne Bay, about a mile offshore, called Stiltsville. And these were built in the 30s. During Prohibition era, it was a place to go and kind of drink beyond the law for bootleggers. And a few of these remain to this day. This is a recent photograph. Sadly, this photograph is last week. This building, there's only 7 of them left. Now there's 6 of them left. And because of safety issues and storm damage and Durham issues, they're prevented from like rebuilding any of these. So as they fall to the sea, there's no more, you know. Anyway, but I want to return to the museum and just highlight another local reference. A lot of the buildings pre-1942, pre-1940 are constructed of this tree. It's called a slash pine or Miami-Dade pine. And this was a local hardwood, well, not a hardwood, it's a pine, it's a conifer, but a local wood that grew in old growth canopies and is said to rival the strength and stiffness of steel. And a few things, it resists rotting as a result of being exposed to the elements, and it also resists termites. So to this day, a lot of the buildings pre-1940 are framed, the roof trusses, the walls even are constructed of Dade County pine. But there's really no more of it. It's kind of all gone. And before I kind of get a little deeper into the comparison of the Perez and the use of wood and the kind of necessity of concrete because of the climate, this is a great book by Adrian Forty called Concrete and Culture. And I just wanted to read one passage from it in which he kind of calls attention to the idea of concrete as a natural material. He says, concrete is not natural, but that is not to say that it is unnatural. Its being not natural is both its virtue and its failing. Its virtue in that as a synthetic material, and especially when reinforced with steel, it can achieve things that would be impossible with any naturally occurring material. And I would say that within the Perez Art Museum, there's a real struggle to kind of take what is really a kind of generic modernist material such as concrete, which can be made anywhere, shipped in the ingredients shipped to any location and mixed on site, as opposed to using a local material that is gathered around the site. And so here you see an exquisitely crafted full-scale mock-up built next to the building along the Perez Art Museum. You can see the Adrian Art Center in the background, the Metro Mover stop here. But what you see here, I'm going to go into the details of this and kind of how they went about, constructing these things. I would just call attention to the fact that despite this being a concrete building, you see plenty, actually in the trellis, you see these green heart trellis shading elements, but also on the ground, you see throughout the building the kind of the hallmarks of a board form. And the architects speak about it as if it's a piece of petrified wood. There's a clear reference to wood, although it is really constructed of concrete. And so here, this is a photo that I actually took from the scaffolding. These are mock-ups that were built along the west side of the site, and they were demolished, right before the building opened. One additional thing I'll say is that I just want to, this comes from a book about mock-ups, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but just to call, this is a chart that I put together with the architects showing the kind of wide, and rigorous use of mock-ups throughout the construction process. Ordinarily, we might think that we would build mock-ups at the beginning, but they are constantly, building full-scale representations to solve certain issues of tectonics and building throughout the entire project schedule. So, the building opens here right before 2014. They're still constructing mock-ups on site to figure some things out. This is the first image one of the first renderings that Herzog de Meuron published. This was a model that they built. And what you can see here, a few things. The overall form is consistent, but if you look at the envelope, the concrete envelope of the galleries, which seem to hover above the ground, the galleries here were proposed to be made of precast planks of concrete. Herzog de Meuron know very well, high quality concrete, and it's something pretty tough to do in Miami. Miami's not known for its really pristine concrete. So as a way to kind of approach the project from a distance in Switzerland, there was an effort to think about using something precast that they could cast in the shop and bring to the site and really exert ultimate control over the material. And in fact, this is the first mock-up they built for the project. This is the full-scale mock-up. You can see the scale of these precast planks. And I have some photos, they're not included here, but they CNC milled, I want to say these are 28-foot long, 10-meter long molds, where they actually CNC milled a faux wood grain and then cast these really massive precast planks that were to be mounted. And then for a variety of technical reasons, cost considerations, this was abandoned. And in fact, they decided, well, we still want to go for this kind of organic quality of the concrete, like they had the wood grain exaggerated in the previous scheme. Here, this is an image of the Shellwager Lorenz Foundation building in Basel. And this building is actually somewhat remarkable. They excavated the site for the project and they retained all the rubble from the excavation, and they mixed that rubble, cast it into the concrete, which is cast in place. And then they used a form retarder so that the exterior layer of the concrete doesn't quite cure. And so after about 48 hours, they can release the formwork, and basically with rakes, they call it scratching the surface. So kind of rake off the superficial layer and expose the aggregate, which actually came from the site. And it's kind of known for these organic windows. But I really see this as an important precursor to the Perez. They also do something quite savvy, I think, to kind of integrate the construction into the locale. Here, these are photos of a competitive mock-up process that they prescribe. So basically, the architects issued a set of written documents to a number of builders interviewing and bidding on the project, and they asked them to construct. These are called concrete tombstones. They asked them to construct a specific kind of tombstone, 3 specific types: a flat, smooth tombstone, a scratch, as in the Shellwager, and then also, I don't know, a few others, maybe a hammered textured one. And so they actually had this competition. So the builders actually constructed these, brought them on site. The architect's client kind of inspected them. And, they knew what they wanted. I think it's very interesting because they knew what they wanted, and they knew how to kind of specify it. But I think here they're really looking not only for who's qualified to actually pull off the quality of work that they want, but also they're kind of open to who might have a better solution to this. And these are some of the photos that you see from these concrete tombstones, some of the details. You see the aggregate exposed. This one is actually kind of chipped off with a rock hammer. This one is polished smooth with a grinder. This one uses like a Spalding hammer drill. And then at a certain point, let me go backwards and forwards. They realized as a result of the structure, because they had to leave all the shoring in place until they topped out the structure. After all of that, they realized that they had to leave the formwork in place for far too long for the form retarders to work. So what needed to happen later was that they needed to actually hand chip the building. So this was another mock-up that they constructed, once they began construction, realizing, they need to actually hand chip this thing. And you see, actually, I guess this one is still, I think part of this is still scratched as was planned, such as this. But by the time they release all the formwork, you see the Perez here perfectly smooth, right? And they weren't actually to rake the surface. So they constructed a series of new mock-ups, and a bit more laborious of a process. They had to now go back, in addition to this, curing for really its full 28 days to set up its strength. It's on the shoreline with a lot of salinity in the air. So they also put things such as blast furnace slag into the concrete, something the concrete additive they use for bridges and infrastructure to make a super hard form of concrete, less pervious to the saltwater air to protect the reinforcing. So they created this kind of bulletproof concrete that they then had to come, hand chisel. And after a lot of experiments and rehearsal, what we saw over the course of almost 8 months were basically a few guys who just went around up and down, hand chiseling the outside of the concrete. So you see here in the book, these are numbered and labeled, but you see one mock-up here, another mock-up here, another one here, another one here, and there were a few others. This is right before they were demolished. And back to what I would call the integrated mock-up. This is one where they're kind of bringing all the parts together. You see the front porch, the kind of cast planks that create the outdoor terrace, very much resembling like wood boards. These are actually, many of them are porous, so water percolates between them. And then on top, there's a cast in place section of the building. And then there are a series of precast elements. So these columns with these precast beams and these precast tees that are actually hung beneath it. Here are these precast columns. These black plates that you see mid-span are actually, initially I thought they were just plates to attach the shoring. But if you look, these actually are kind of propped up above that plate. Those are actually stiffening plates because there's such a slender profile. They prevent buckling in the center. So they're like a kind of stiffening splint right at mid-span. And to this day, those are exposed. You see them in the museum. And then here, this is one of my favorite photographs of the project. You see the kind of the textures of the concrete here, in addition to the precast elements and the tees being hung. And this is before the timber elements are added up top. But you kind of understand all the different systems of the project at play here. And again, a building without a shirt. The galleries are kind of exposed and voided between. There's actually quite a few others, but I just wanted to show one of. This is the backside of that integrated mock-up, which is testing a variety of conditions. Here, even going to the extent where you see different frit patterns and mullion framing finish options for the glass. And this actually represents the upper story glass that we see up top. So on the ground floor of the Perez, the second floor overhangs it. The mullions are actually, what we would typically think of as metal structural mullions. They're actually cast concrete as well. And there's a couple of finish options for those. But on the ground floor, these are cast. They're also cast on the upper floors. But on the upper floors, they're turned in. And the idea is that up here between the galleries, this is all smooth. So they polish the concrete, turn the structure in. On the ground floor, these project out. And you see this kind of texture. These are called rebates, these grooves in the ceiling. And here, they're really testing, looking up at a certain angle to see if they can mitigate reflections and also cover spandrel panels and the structure behind. A few other things that they ran into, I really see this as a kind of an admirable wrestling match with the material, something that I think kind of, calls attention to their embrace of its unpredictability. This is in the auditorium where you see the step seats. And what you see here is slag staining. So a few things happened because they had to leave the formwork in place for so long. At a certain point, they were released, and some of the unpredictable things that happened were the concrete was a dark blue. It kind of lightened up over time, but they weren't quite sure. They had to hire, there's a concrete forensic expert named Reg Huff, who's a concrete consultant that many architects use. And he had to come and kind of look at it and say, I think this is because it was starved of oxygen for so long on the surface. But what you also see are something called rebar shadowing. So you see it here, you see the staining of the concrete here because it was left in place so long. So these horizontal lines are actually the rebar kind of showing through the concrete. And they had to pursue various treatments to kind of, etch it away and create a more homogeneous surface. And then I'll just end, with this image of you see the kind of two different materials, the very rough textured treatment of concrete around some surfaces, and where they carve into the quartz, they really go to great lengths to polish and smooth it and give it a different kind of quality. And I would say it's a kind of it's a real catalog of the qualities of a single material that really seem to work with the location and the locale of Miami in a particular way that I think is not just concrete as an abstract generic material, but something much more interacted with. And I admire the project for that. I'll just take a few minutes to flip through a house. This is a house that I designed and renovated and built a few years ago, and it has some similarities and it's also kind of struggled with concrete. And then I think Jason is going to show a house with some similar interactions, and maybe there's something here about this critical regionalism that really, forces us to engage materials in a way that perhaps you're not forced to do in other locations. But this is also a story about FIU. I actually began this project with a grant at the university, researching some sustainable forms of concrete. And these are some material samples that we made during our research. This is a hybrid form of concrete where instead of casting gravel, which is very heavy and has a high carbon footprint, we don't really have gravel here in Miami. We have limestone, crushed limestone. So river rock, things like that need to be shipped here. We were actually looking for a more sustainable form of concrete where we cast wood into the concrete, mineralized wood. So there's a kind of petrification of concrete in these studies as well. This is an old 1962 house. The house ended here where this roof jog is, and we added about 400 square feet to it. And we clad the south facade with panels made of this wood constituted concrete. That the wood acts like a kind of insulating skin, but the story of the concrete comes from this tree. So Dade County pine is gone, and what's taken this place is this tree called the Melaleuca tree. Tea tree oil comes from Melaleuca. It's native to Australia. But what you see, these are aerial photos of the Everglades, and it shows how Melaleuca has kind of taken over portions of the Everglades, growing in really dense stands. It effectively chokes out all the native flora and fauna of the Everglades, and it was scattered by aircraft by the Army Corps of Engineers very early, like in the 50s, to help dry up canal beds and aid in drainage of the Everglades and firm up, shorelines for canals and whatnot. But it's sort of quickly become a big environmental nuisance. So we received, thousands of pounds of chipped and mineralized Melaleuca wood chips. These are some of the things that we experimented with. These are compression cylinders. We like the texture, but we also evaluated, strength and texture based on, unique recipes and combinations of material. Here you can see it in a compression cylinder lab. And, typical structural concrete is 3,000 to 5,000 PSI. But we found in our research, we could get this as high as like 1,500 PSI. Not quite as strong to be columns or beams, but we realized we don't need 3,000 PSI everywhere. And so we cast these large chunks and we cut it and exposed the wood and the interior. And then we did a variety of formula testing, empirical testing, where we starved it of water and started to kind of fine tune a custom mix for this material. And then we had the opportunity to do the addition to this house. This is the current site plan. And this diagram here on the bottom, this axon, shows what we added to the house. So initially the house was like a kind of fishhook J shape. And we extended it to create a really deep courtyard house. This is a model we built of what we were adding to the existing house, leaving everything else out. And here you can see from this line, we added this on. So to enter the house, you walk down this deep courtyard and kind of enter it at the front through the back. Yeah. These are some views of the courtyard looking out from the front door to the courtyard. Incidentally, this is not fog. This was like a smoky day because of a wildfire in the Everglades. This is looking up the courtyard towards the front door. And so you see, this is the new addition clad in these concrete tiles. And this is the kind of historic garage of the 1962 house. And on this backside, we didn't want to, really call attention to the joint between new and old. So we clad over it and to insulate really all the southern exposure of the house. We coordinated the openings of the windows with the modularity of the tiles. The entire house is on a 24-inch grid. But you see in the morning, you get these great shadows that kind of strike it horizontally. The house really faces due east. So in the morning, the sun really glances it. These are some of the molds that we, fabricated and experimented with panels. And then we had to actually find a local precaster to make these for us. And many did not want to take it on. As soon as they found out there was like an unconventional ingredient in it, they really didn't want any part of it. But we finally found one in Hollywood, Florida, and using their equipment, we fine-tuned the mix and made many more molds. This is the master mold that we CNC milled and brought to them, and you can see the kind of texture from the CNC milling machine, from the tool that we used. This is the back of it, and then we just had 4 different types. It's hung in a pretty typical precast detail. These are all the tiles delivered to the site. And basically it's hung on clips and tied back to the wall with corrugated brick ties. And then the wall section, we tried to, call attention to the exterior layer by having some low windows that line up with the grid of the floor, some ordinary height, furniture height windows, and then taller ones in the addition. So you see, this is a model of the new addition that we added. This is a photo from the outside. And these were the wall sections. So we get a thicker wall section. We made an attempt to kind of bring the softness of the material to the interior of the house. So inside this room, you see the medium height, the tall window, and the low window. And then each room, we plugged in a kind of a built-in desk for each of the 3 bedrooms. We have 3 bedrooms here. This one is a rounded corner. This one comes into the diagonal following the sun angle. And this one rounds. And there's a little vanity. And then last is the kitchen window. Some photos of those. And this is basically where I'll end. It's a deep courtyard. It's glass here, but it still creates some kind of privacy through its depth. So only when you're kind of standing dead on do you see all the way to the front door. Anyway, I'll end it there and let Jason take it back and look at his concrete exploration. And then return.
Thanks, Nick. So I just wanted to add to the next conversation and also pitch his book, which is amazing. And I would even say that you'll see his influence in mock-ups has even trickled its way over to me in my work. So I do appreciate his efforts. And the house is great. I love the house. It's beautiful. And if you can come, it is one of those places where you definitely want to fondle the walls. They really are tactile and really quite intriguing. So yeah, I also wanted to say one last thing about Pam, and Nick mentioned it, is that Herzog de Meuron in their monograph, I think uniquely, I looked at a couple and I didn't see it, really do call out Terry Riley as the force behind the Perez Art Museum. And I'll just add with the anecdote, I think it's Ralph Simmons, what's the curator's, the director's name?
At the moment?
Yeah. Simmons, what's his first name? I gave Franklin Simmons. Yeah. He had presented, Christine Biswacker had come back. She was the project architect for Pam, and he had said, as far as introduction, that the old museum, which was housed in the Philip Johnson building, had 50,000 visitors a year. But since the Pam had opened, they were averaging about 350,000 visitors a year. So I kind of later I said, Franklin, I don't believe your statistics. And he kind of looked at me and sort of goes, what? I said, there's no way 50,000 people went to the first museum. And he laughed a sigh of relief, which is just to say that it was not, I mean, the interior of that museum was not really appropriate for a museum, let alone one for Miami. So I'll just talk quickly about also a residential project that is under construction. So in a way, very contemporary because it's not even finished. A little addition to an art collector. And this is sort of the scheme where the existing house is this sort of simple gabled roof house, sort of horizontally disposed with a rather nice corner porch, which is sort of the perfect Miami space where you can have a screen porch open to hang out basically most of the year, except when it gets really humid. So our addition was just to be a sort of contrast to that, a sort of vertical tower, and it's on the back. And the photo that I've been showing throughout the presentation of that banyan tree is actually in this client's backyard right next to our building. So this is, again, that extraordinary landscape. An interesting little house. It has two frontages. Another reason why the kind of collision of the two architectures may be appropriate. This is kind of the front of the house, and then this addition is in the back and is where you kind of, it's a carriage house. It's both a garage and office and gallery. So the existing house is surrounded by these ring of coral rock walls, which I'll show you at the end. Also kind of geological, seemed to sort of be embedded in the landscape, and had a little sort of crummy carport in the back of it, which we remove, and then we add this sort of collection of boxes. Just some quick plans of that. Just again, a building that abuts the existing, but also continues the sort of interior public space of the original house. And basically redesigning the whole backyard of it has a pool and a terrace, and then these are the banyan trees, and this is a grove of oaks. So really rather extraordinary context for a house, and some sections through the building, which it basically is a sort of vertical piece. This is this two-story gallery for a bunch of different art that the client has. Some images of the building. These are stills from a movie. And then this is the kind of sort of move. Here's that big porch. And then these are what I call the sort of art boxes. He has a Chihuly, an Aloft for Eliason, a ton of Saraceno, bunch of art pieces that actually engage with light. So each of those boxes are designed to both be lit artificially, but also mark the passage of time throughout the day. But those boxes, I think it's a building that addresses the sort of, richness of both the interior as it relates to the collection, but also the exterior, which is this really set in this kind of monumental trees. So this box is meant both to be both protective of what the contents are, but also celebrate the context in which it resides. So these are just a series of elevations of the formwork for this is the Stair Tower. And this is an image of it under construction. This is probably a few months ago. And I like to say that, and Nick had said it, the sort of unpredictable quality of concrete, even though this is a very small little building, the sort of armature, the formwork is this extraordinary structure in itself, and itself I find quite beautiful, but it really is sort of holding this caged tiger of the concrete, because obviously it's heaviest and most wild right when it's poured. So this absurdly over-structured moment, which seems to, once it's taken apart, just vanish, and the thing has a sort of serene quality of sitting there, but does have a tendency to look like this something is being caged in there that doesn't want to get out. We should be protected from it. So a bunch of samples of how we did this. We got this very smooth plywood as the formwork, and put a series of grooves in it with the idea that they would produce projections, light projections or reveals. And again, to Nate's point, it's such a wild thing that we had to experiment with how long the formworks were in place, how to take them off. And the reality is this is actually the formwork after it was removed from the form. And the issue, it turned out some of the formwork, the sort of reveals stayed on the building, but many of them got pulled off. And it turns out, and we knew it would be a combination of that, but the reality was that the smoothness of the plywood allowed, even when they got completely pulled out, to contrast with the roughness of the reveal. So in both ways, it turned out all right. And this is a view of it. This is recently, we have these are the fiberglass form ties so they don't rust. What's interesting is, in spite of being a concrete town, as Nick says, not many people really know how to do good finished concrete. They almost, like he says, sort of run from the project. We luckily found a contractor who was very excited about this, a Venezuelan contractor who had done this sort of stuff in Venezuela, so was not shy about it. So this was the textures that we got, which I'd like to think have a relationship to the sort of geological rawness of the site. And then this is taken yesterday, where the building, really is in this grove, completely surrounded. This is one of the walls that we rebuilt, but again, this kind of entirely, I would say, sort of organic presence in the Florida landscape, and hopefully the little box has this sort of mini monumentality to complement the context of both the banyan tree on the right and the oaks on the left. So we just thought we would wrap up with some work of the locals. That, I think, if you can say, covers the contemporary scene from all over the world to our humble backyards, literally.
Thanks, Jason. That was terrific. There were a couple of images that really struck me. So first of all, I think what was interesting about it was the way that somehow, I wish that I'd been given this lecture when I'd first arrived in Miami, because it was incredibly informative. But I mean, it also struck me that somehow what we're doing, in a sense, with this non-residential program where we just parachute in for short periods, for a week or 9 days or whatever, once a semester, it's quintessentially Miami, because that's what people do in Miami. No, it's made me regret we can't be there next month when we were planning to be there, because it's an extraordinary place to come and visit, like a sort of butterfly landing on an exotic landscape. But there were two images, one in your lecture, Jason, and one yours, Nick, that really struck me as being incredibly interesting and speaking about Miami. I mean, of course, the architecture is extraordinary, and that itself is amazing. But there were two images that really stuck out. One was the Cristo image you started off with, Jason. This wrapping of an island with this pink membrane, and that kind of struck me as kind of really emblematic in some ways of what Miami is, because it was kind of like taking a fairly ordinary island, but somehow celebrating it and drawing attention to it with this kind of exotic pink of this kind of the flamingo, right? I mean, it's kind of this weird bird that really speaks about the kind of weirdness of Florida itself. And it struck me that actually you could take that as being emblematic of what Herzog de Meuron had done with that parking structure, to take the mundane thing like a parking structure and to make it extraordinary. That really kind of seemed to me an amazing kind of gesture. So that on one hand struck me as being a kind of an interesting kind of almost hieroglyphic that gave you the story about Miami in an interesting kind of way. But then the other one was Nick's reference to something that I find really interesting and extraordinary. That is Stiltsville. I mean, this amazing, maybe could you put the image of Stiltsville up again, because this amazing structure that unfortunately falling apart, but they spoke of a certain sort of moment. They speak about Miami itself because they are kind of like these things where, I guess it was during the Prohibition, where you had to be 1 mile off the coast to be able to drink and then gamble and whatever else. But it's almost emblematic of Miami, because Miami is kind of like at the very end. And this is like the kind of Miami in extremis, this kind of, this little thing beyond that Miami. And it really speaks about somehow what Miami was kind of all about, a kind of sort of escapist mentality of just having this moment of being outside the normal, this exotic kind of experience of something. So it's emblematic of that. So people kind of come here for this moment, which is very special, and it, it's almost like you get the kind of the Zaha appearing and landing, someone very exotic appearing and landing in a very exotic climate. So anyway, these two images, the Stiltsville image and the pink of Cristo, really struck me as being kind of emblematic of Miami in an interesting kind of way.
Yeah, no, I mean, with your charge, I had to kind of figure out what a start was. And we just had the retrospective of their work, and Christo actually did come. And I got his signature.
Me too.
I think Nick did too. We all went there. But it really was, and I have to recommend, I don't know, I forgot the name of this documentary film, but the whole act of the piece, really, if you sort of look at it from soup to nuts, was Miami sort of writ large. And I say that because it was not just the sort of negotiation of the environment, right? So to build these things, right, which are these large sheets of, I guess, I forgot what the actual material is, but these huge sheets that are tied to these buoys, floating on the water. I mean, in terms of just pure like tectonics, was a challenge to make that work, right? So they would all be equidistant. But what was interesting about it was how they negotiated the politics of local Miami personalities, literally payoffs, all these different things. And the personalities that kind of crept up, and the sort of power structures that it sort of scratched against rather, is extraordinary. Again, this was a multi-year project that was there for 11 days. It was built with community people, like people volunteered to do it. You know, you had these kids, you know, the very 70s, sort of early 80s, with their jean shorts dragging this stuff out into the bay. You know, all the sort of, I guess the sort of, you know, scientists saying that this was going to kill every wildlife along these islands. Really was such an embedded project. I mean, I'm sure all architecture, you know, through permitting, through all the stuff you have to do to get anything, but I really think of it as an architectural project at its heart, and one that, I mean, could you do it someplace else? I imagine you could, but really is a Miami project. And also its kind of elusiveness, and the idea that, you know, if you flew in at the right time, you got to see that, which is also, I kind of think to your point about people kind of coming in, the idea that that's who it was for, the audience of people landing and taking off in Miami, is sort of a wild thing, that it was almost not for the locals, because if you you couldn't see it if you were sitting on the ground. I just, the more I think about it, again, a kind of sort of simple gesture, it really is a rather complex, extraordinary thing that have happened. And I think the joke now is like, could they do it today? Like, good luck, you know?
Yeah, the other thing, so go ahead.
Oh, no, just I can add that at that moment, you know, Miami was in turmoil. It was the 1983 that the Mariel boat lift had brought, you know, tens of thousands of Cubans to Miami that just sort of dumped them off. And it was also the age of the cocaine cowboys.
Right.
You know, I don't know, Miami's banking structure and the whole financial structure of the city was just in chaos, because you had this drug money coming in.
Yeah.
So it was a particular moment too. And then to have Christo come in and do this sort of ethereal thing that spoke to the world of beauty and art, which is, whoa. Anyway, that's all.
Yeah, just one thing, Nick, I just look at this picture. What I meant to say was actually that the Calvert Club, or these kind of people all here on this thing, it kind of reminded me of that photograph of those architects, you know, together in that room, and Rem resolutely refusing to wear a bow tie, you know, but this kind of this collection, but also in some way that kind of the kind of the exquisite corpse facade, where all these architects had also come together. So that's why I felt this image was somehow also very representative in a kind of weird way of Miami. But
you know, both of these, both the projects you reference, you know, they're kind of Miami's visionary architecture, in that they kind of, there's no ground, they're on the water. Jason's engages the shoreline, but you know what's so amazing? There's no grid, there's no parcels. I think that's part of the reason you can't do this now. You can't touch the seabed, you can't mess up the grass, and these things are just, you know, they're from a past time. You can't even manipulate the shoreline now.
Maybe we could try and bring in our DDES candidates and to sort of comment on these things, because it's extraordinary lectures. Thank you so much. I learned so much out of this, but very thought-provoking as well. You can always guarantee that Marina will ask a good question. No pressure, Marina. No pressure.
Yeah, hello. Thank you for your great presentation. It was super interesting. I learned a lot about what you show us, and more. Yeah, I was interested too in this kind of pink or pretty cuteness as a brand in a way of Miami, and also maybe my question is like I found like this tension between these two things in a way, like the bottom up process of the brand. Like something that sometimes could be like arbitrary in a way, and at the same time this need of a top-down input from the city as well. So my question could be, or what I was wondering, like, was about the performance that you can understand that these architects, could be maybe the Herzog de Meuron last example, are seeking with this kind of building. So in a way, how do you think that this building will change or evolve or mutate? Like if it's going to do it like under this same idea of brand, or is the opposite, that this kind of idea of brand maybe is more directed to Jason lecture, or is this idea of brand in a way reducing certain architectural practice, like some kind of blindness, engine of production in a way? No, what do you think about this tension between the brand, like a bottom-up process, or the idea of the performance as a top-down influence to the designs?
Well, I guess I'll answer it two ways. One sort of about the specifics of the museum and the context, and the other one just to talk about sort of practice generally. But specifically, what's interesting about this building, and again, also a political touch point and a hotbed for a moment. What Miami has, and actually we didn't show it, there are a lot of private collectors in Miami, and they build their own museums. The Rubella collection, the Cisneros collection, and bound in the story of the Perez and formerly the Art Museum, Miami Art Museum, is this sort of, I would say on one hand, distrust of the public institution, and on the other hand, the sort of ego of the collector, right? And that's what's remarkable, and what people went crazy, I mean, literally front page stories, was when George Perez gave the money for the naming rights for the museum, it became George Perez's museum. And that pissed off all the major collectors, so they went crazy. They're like, the hell with this, went bananas. And I think this issue of brand was part of that, because this guy got his name on the building, and no one else did, but he played by the rules. He paid whatever it was. And so when you go to Miami, what's interesting is it is a place of small museums. All these little museums have popped up. And both personality, politics, whatever you want to have. So, I would say what's interesting about the museum is that it's not a very large museum. It doesn't have a very big collection. And as a result, the city, the sort of role of museum in the city is a kind of dispersed event, which is sort of fascinating. And one of our colleagues, Kathy Left, who was the former director of the Wilsonia, actually specializes in this sort of curating and ensuring for legacy collections, like a future for these collections. Like, okay, if you're going to do this, you need to have whatever kind of financial and legal structure set up so that you can have your museum exist in perpetuity. And it keeps going. We literally have new museums popping up out of this modality. So the museum, which I think is, I would argue, a kind of anti-brand, to your point, is also understood as that thing which is fundamentally branded, which I don't think was ever the intention of Herzog de Meuron, as one person's thing, which is, of course, very bizarre. But again, that's the reality of it. Now, as it relates to, I would say, Herzog's sort of a clever slipperiness, right? I think the point of the performance, right? The kind of the wow of the Herzog building is how clever and rooted they can behave, and they do it over and over. They don't always do it. They have a few hiccups, but they certainly did it here. And I also add that they've done about 3 or 4 other buildings, which I didn't mention, which are good and nice buildings, but they haven't hit it the way they hit it with these. But the 1111, what was remarkable is how fast it did become a brand, right? It became this kind of, all of a sudden, like the parking garage was a Miami phenomena, and Herzog had managed to capitalize on it. Like, there was, I'm sure people were doing, they're doing lots of parking garages, but until they hit that one, like it was somehow not an acknowledged building type of real architectural power. So I think, to your point, that's why I present that way. I think the sort of the condition of brand, where it arises, is very interesting in this city.
No, I think, Jason, that was a great question. Thank you. I think that's an absolutely fascinating thing. I noticed this actually in China when I first went there. I was amazed by the fact they had Rem and Zaha and all these people kind of brought in. I thought this is fantastic. There's this inspired, commissioners of architecture. But then I began to realize that really what they represented was brands. Zaha was like Gucci. It was literally like that. And I think what you have here is interesting, because the way you presented that particular project, where it was certain architects for certain brands, they really actually were teaming them up, and so you got the architect as brand in a very literal way, which I thought was completely fascinating. And I also thought, because going back to our lecture last week when Claudia was talking about Zaha's parking garage that didn't actually go ahead, right? But it was almost like, Herzog de Meuron had done one, so Zaha was going to do one. It was almost like you were competing. It was like brand against brand, and architect became the brand. So I think that's a really super interesting metaphor for the whole thing, the idea of architect as brand.
Yeah, well, it's also such a developer's town. And there's a constant struggle. A developer wants, part of this idea of like parachuting in is that, actually Terry Riley told me this, that the local architects, they all get beat up by the developers to basically do the same building over and over. And then when they want something really unconventional, they fly somebody in from Europe to kind of break the molds of what we're doing here. And so there really there is a kind of local typology, and then everything else is outsourced in a sense. And the developers know they can sell that tower for more if Zaha designs it, obviously.
Yeah, no, I think it's what was maybe left out, but it was the architectonica logic of kind of these generic tower blocks that are otherwise that form the backdrop to these extraordinary gems in a way.
Yeah.
It's worth saying also that I think, what we also left out was that this was kind of mainly Miami Beach or downtown Miami that we were seeing. And in fact, if you go back, Miami actually is the 4th poorest city in the States. And in fact, there's a lot of people going back inland, the kind of Cali Ocho, the kind of the Cuban terrain, where people, when you come from Cuba, you don't come with any money, don't come with anything. So there's a lot of poverty in Miami as well, alongside this exotic kind of orchid-like existence on Miami Beach itself. Just to say also one thing, that always strikes me about Miami when. How exotic it is, this idea of Jason talking about I moved to Miami from the United States. It's kind of, it really is the kind of, that sums it all up, because when you arrive in Miami, one thing that strikes me is that the dominant language is Spanish. The dominant language is Spanish, and the climate is so otherworldly as well. You almost feel like you've parachuted into a kind of Caribbean island or something like that. It doesn't really feel like the United States at all, which opens up a kind of like a kind of a freedom to be otherwise. That's, I think, adds to that sort of approach. I think one of the things I would say is there is a comparison, also a contrast to be made with Las Vegas, because I think the two cities that have something similar, you go to Miami, to Las Vegas to escape, but there's something that's much more kind of refined about some of the kind of the restaurants and the bars, which also form part of this as well. I mean, the kind of Philip Stark interiors of some of those hotels on the water on Miami Beach, absolutely extraordinary spaces. They're magical in their own kind of way, and so there's something a little tacky I find about Las Vegas. It's all about sort of whatever money and gambling, but there's something similar at the same different about Miami compared to Las Vegas.
Well, they're both resort towns, Miami Beach in particular, and casinos played a big role early on. There was always an inertia to establish casinos here, even as recently as a few years ago.
Yeah, I can't speak to Las Vegas, but the sort of distance. I mean, oddly enough, it's a 3-hour plane ride from New York. We'll just say 3.5 hours, whatever that is. But its remoteness, which can be debated because the sort of development of Miami, we could say now goes all the way up past West Palm. Like it's a sort of a continuous urbanism, this sort of linear metropolis. But I do think it has enough of a disconnect and separation from sort of the next major city, which you could, I don't know, Atlanta, or something. I don't know what you would say the next major is, which is, by car 10 hours away. It's about, roughly 500 miles away. It doesn't have a kind of like if Los Angeles has a relationship to Las Vegas, right? That they're sort of connected. Miami doesn't have that other, you could argue maybe New York, but in a way, not really, because it really is very, very far away. And it doesn't have its next best. I mean, I think of Europe as, a continent of capitals. Like all the sort of, capitals have some kind of secondary cities that always speak to that one. Miami, and this is a kind of American thing where the center of commerce and the center of politics are separated. And there's a bunch of them. The most famous is New York and Albany, right? You couldn't have the center of government in New York because it would be the most corrupted possible government. So you have to pull it out of the center of commerce and separate it. So Miami and Tallahassee are 500 miles away from each other because the potential corruption would be too explosive if they were existing together. But this is the kind of, the problem of Rome, right? That they didn't separate the politics from Rome. So it sort of sits there on top of everything else. But there are a series of these kinds of American, the way the state is built is that you separate politics from the metropolis, which again is the idea of Washington, D.C., right? That it isn't, the capital used to be in New York. So, but they said, it's probably not a good idea. So, and again, the idea of, your representatives leave the place you go and go up to D.C. to kind of engage in politics. I think there's that distance is part of Miami's story too.
Maybe just one thing to point out to those who are not familiar with it, the term snowbirds. This refers to, I think, primarily Canadians. I mean, this time of year, if you know what the temperature is in Canada, you know why people, Canadians are quite happy to come to Miami. In fact, I recall, I think 2 years ago, we had to find a replacement speaker fairly instantaneously for about 3 days notice. And I thought, oh, I know who to go to. So I emailed Philip Beasley up in Toronto, and within about sort of 20 seconds, or he'd email me back and said, yes, I can come. It was just, it's a very interesting kind of, so the snowbirds, as I understand it, are some migratory kind of birds that pass through Miami, literally birds, but they're also used as a metaphor for this kind of, the Canadians and others who touched down. And I think it's probably worth saying also that that Miami is a kind of like a kind of hub for South American airlines and also for American airlines from Latin America. Often, if you fly from Europe, you might change planes in Miami. So it becomes this. It's a kind of hub, and I think some of the birds you get there are just exotic and weird. I mean, it's amazing. And they're passing through, migrating over the years. So somehow the snowbird is a really interesting emblem for Miami.
No, and to that point, there's a series of professional protective rules for the state of Florida because of that. So for professionals who work in New York and want to continue to work there, there's actually a residency requirement that you have to spend at least 51% of your time in the state to call yourself a professional there because of that exact problem. Also for tax reasons, we don't have a state income tax. Also a great reason why people will come here for the better part of the year so that they can avoid state. But again, they have to do at least, greater than 1/2 of the year of residency to claim full-time residency here. But that's exactly a symptom of what you're describing.
Although Trump and Palm Beach is not allowed to stay there very long.
Sometimes it just works out just beautifully, and you just can't believe it. So poetry, there's still poetry in the world. But he moved. He changed his residency. So we'll see what happens with that.
I would say also there's something worth discussing maybe in a future talk about this idea of the economics of the place. Art Basel, which seems to be this huge cultural event, it's really it's a for sale market, and it's so vibrant because the galleries move so many paintings and really make most of their money at that time. So what's seen as the kind of culture event, it's really an economic event, and Miami really straddles that line in a weird way.
Yeah, I think the architecture of Art Basel is also kind of interesting because a lot of the things are just simply temporary structures that are put there for a bit like Christo, right? Briefly, and that's exotic. And these people fly in for it, and it's a very interesting kind of event from a kind of anthropological point of view. Just seeing these rich patrons appearing and different tribes. Yeah, Art Basel is also kind of fascinating.
It's funny you bring that because I was thinking about that as the start, as opposed to 1983 because of it. Because again, you can't underestimate that the power of that vehicle, culturally and internationally. But I do think the Christo. I would argue that the Christo would be the sort of the moment when people thought, oh, maybe this is where we could sort of create this new art center. Not again, the sort of unintended consequences of that thing. You can draft any history you want, but I did think of Art Basel as maybe that moment. But through 1 to 3 other sort of dates and when people were here, it didn't quite work. But I would say that was a critical moment too.
Yeah, just again to mention a bit, we will be talking about Art Basel. We have a session on Art Basel. Just to clarify, I mean, even though, of course, Herzog de Meuron are based in Basel, it's got nothing to do with Basel in Switzerland. It is an international art market. I think there's also Hong Kong and things that lands in December in Miami. It has also a design component. There's Design Miami that Zaha would be part of many years. So there's this exotic snowbird, as it were, of an event that happens. But it's about Miami, not necessarily about Basel.
Sure. Yeah. And again, it's so peculiar that it's Basel here in Miami. To your point, Jason, about the design district is also not like a real neighborhood. It's like the Ordos houses in Mongolia, built within the last 10 years by architects outside Miami primarily. It's a very bizarre thing that we have here.
I think that the design district itself is also an interesting phenomenon in the sense that if you think about us all within a developer logic, and maybe that's the way to think about it. One of the strategies that's always been deployed is to kind of send in the artists first, in terms of development. That's actually happened, for example, at SciArc, when they moved to the new building in downtown, this freight church. The area around it was very close to Skid Row and was very underdeveloped, and send in the art, well, in this case, architects rather than artists, but send them in, and they got a special deal to come in there. And actually it actually worked. The SciArc became a catalyst to the real estate market around that area, and now it's become full of these kind of either lofts, well, they've run enough lofts, so they make their own replica lofts now. It has this effect of really making the development. It's an engine behind the development.
Yeah, the design district you're right, it's done in reverse. It's kind of it's a way to bring people to this expensive development. Wynwood, on the other hand, was done like that. Wynwood, the artist came in, and there was a developer who was smart about having an anchor tenant, this diner called Joey's, and then the Wynwood walls with, you know, graffiti on all the walls, and the entire neighborhood became known as an arts district. And now it's like, you know, one of the coolest neighborhoods you could live in, I guess. You're right. Those two things are done in opposite orders.
And of course, we're part of it. FIU School of Architecture is about to set up base. In a way, also a real estate deal, as it were. Jason, do you want to say something about that? Or?
No, I left out a lot, but Wynwood again would be the most contemporary moment in terms of that story, and I would, and I'm actually doing a project there, and it's the acceleration of the development. Sort of if Basel was 40 years and Christo in the art world, Wynwood's 10, you know, maybe 10, right? And it's going from, you know, here is again the graffiti, a kind of urban art that is latent in this area. We're gonna, you know, crank it up, put some money in there, you know, make it, celebrate it, and then we're gonna develop it. And that, I mean, has happened so fast. I mean, it's an enormous construction site right now, and you know, you're getting these vacant parcels where, you know, all these, you know, warehouses have been raised, and they're building, you know, 20-story towers, you know, off this entire, again, branded moments, you know, that they, you know, every building's got to have a little, you know, sort of graffiti art on it, and then boom, you're okay, build whatever you want. I think maybe one could argue cynically, I think it's sort of the speed of that the clock of that development, I'd say might be cautionary, but it's got some interesting, it's reconsidering a lot of the sort of zoning of Miami, which is, I guess, a whole nother story, which is, again, that's going to tug and pull with the developer will, and managing growth so that, you know, which I would say that this one actually is looking, to your point about affordability, is looking at, you know, workforce housing that could, you know, actually be used by the locals, as opposed to, I mean, one of the thing about the sort of branded skyscraper is that they are empty buildings, right? I'm sure there's a few people there, but this is, you know, the condition of parking money in Miami, because it's relatively safe. It's safer than Venezuela or another country in sort of peril. So, you know, you could make the argument that these architects that are doing these amazing towers are certainly building housing, but housing of a kind that would certainly not address societal's needs in any real way. So there is that kind of, I think you're right to make that point about the whole context that we're talking about, which again, you know, there's the kind of cynicism about a lot of that work, because it isn't for the place.
So they're empty. I mean, I understood that, but there is I don't know the story actually, but that a lot of the development of Miami was through cocaine money, shall we say? It's kind of like, yes, came in. It was, yeah.
That was in the 80s. And
yeah,
now it's flight capital from, yeah, Venezuela, Latin America. And yeah, if you can park your money in Miami, you're doing well. But I wanted to bring up an image from Joan Didion, who wrote a beautiful book on Miami in 1987. And she talked, and this was right after the sort of 80s, that was the cocaine cowboys and you know, an amazing time. But she really talked about Miami as this very, very thin layer of inhabitation with the sea below and the sky above. And the flatness and that sense that life is concentrated in this incredibly thin sort of zone. And I was interested in both presentations, because on the one hand, you can see that platform as a kind of pedestal that you can bring in whatever you want and put it down there, and anything that sticks up is going to be visible. So it is a sort of showroom of architecture on the one hand, and then on the other hand, Herzog de Meuron, and you know, the way that Nick was talking about the mock-ups and the way that they sort of took the time and attention to really look at the beauty of that and to find something that was in the place and in the materials and pull that out, you know, is really beautiful. So I think we have both in Miami. We have the, you know, the flybys, but there's so much here. If you, in the natural realm, in the water, in the rock, that is discoverable. So I was just struck by that contrast between the, you know, way people approach it. And it's not even that local architects have any particular monopoly on understanding the place. It sort of took a Swiss firm to come in and see the, to sort of reread the landscape. Anyway, that's all.
Mm-hmm. I just noticed there's a comment in the chat from Henry saying that Art Basel happened because of Christo's installation, and I think that's also an interesting kind of comment that that's what sparked it off. And I think it's an interesting.
I would like to add something, Neil,
yeah.
just quick.
Yeah, sure.
Hello, I'm Henry. I'm also faculty at FIU. Great seeing everybody here. Great lectures. But I just want to add a couple of things coming from one of the countries that have been mentioned a couple of times. Yes, for Latin Americans, and I guess Marina, who is here, could also confirm, Miami represents the solid institutions, financial institutions, approachable. I mean, like, I guess before people would put money in like Swiss banks and, you know, far from taxes and stuff. But for a lot of people in the Caribbean or Latin American countries, Miami is approachable. They can come, they can speak Spanish with the bank sort of official, and they feel safe. So that, you know, it's like Gray was saying, it's one of the reasons why a lot of like capitals from, you know, Colombia, Brazil, Venezuela, Argentina, and other countries, right, lands here, right? But I also want to say that there is the night club culture, the parties and the night scene in Miami Beach that is very attractive for a lot of people, like during Art Basel days. Like, I don't know if Claudia or in the sort of last week's presentation, they talk about it, but Zaha Hadid was like always out every night, you know, partying, going to places, working. Like, that's like, it has a you know, like a sort of attraction, because you go out one night and you find NBA players, celebrities, you know, singers, musicians, and architects and developers, and it's all like a fauna of these people that, you know, brings something to Miami. Also in times when it's freezing cold in other countries, in other sort of latitudes. One thing that to me was interesting moving to Miami is, for Venezuelans, the high season of Miami is the summer, because that's when there are vacations. And when I moved here, high season is in the winter, or like, you know, it's more familiar. And I was like, what's the reason? And it's like understanding this sort of the snowbirds, like people coming from the north, not from the Caribbean. And that sort of changed my perception of the city big time. Understanding the sort of the quality of the weather, this sort of period of the year, as opposed to the summer. Like, for anyone coming from the Caribbean, the extreme heat and humidity, it's fine. It's just, it's just like normal, right? So, so yeah, I just want to add a couple of the sort of the superficial sort of condition of the city in terms of the branding and the sort of the show off, you know, bodies and beauty and money and power, but also the sort of the connection with the sort of solid institutions, not only financial, but also agencies like the World Bank, like, you know, like a lot of like those institutions that work sort of intensely in Latin America are based here. And, you know, it's close proximity. The same as you were saying about how easy it is to reach to Miami, like to land here. It's, you know, from Europe, it's the same from Latin America, right? So, you know, in that sense, geographically is perfect.
I mean, the other comment was that I've seen increasingly a Chinese tourists arriving in Miami, and I guess it's well, given the fact that one of the big holidays in the Chinese year is just coming up now. You know, in February, there's a big festival happening. There are two holidays in the year, one in October and one in the spring. And if you've ever been in Beijing, I mean, right now in Beijing, it's well below zero in terms of centigrade. I mean, it's freezing. So we might see, although of course China is like 12 hours or 13 hours different, but I suspect that we're going to see many more Chinese tourists coming to Miami because it is completely otherworldly. And yeah. I don't know whether Wang Yu wanted to say anything because she was involved with OMA, and of course OMA's been here as well. But I don't want to put pressure on anyone. But did you want to, Anna? Do you want to add something? I just see a note in the chat.
Yeah, I was just I noticed how the landscape plays a part on the design. Like the Perez Art Museum it's elevated from the ground, you know, and has all those columns, and it feels like it's raised, and it has a very strong similarity to the trees that Jason showed. And then they are like the nature around the landscape and the vegetation, it integrates into the somehow, whether it's on the shape or whether it's part of the architecture itself.
Yeah, when Christine presented it a couple years ago, she explicitly says that tree was a source of inspiration. I don't know if Nick, if you have an image, because they also have the columns, the sort of vertical green columns that are who was sure. who
Patrick LeBlanc.
Patrick LeBlanc does that. So it is, I think, to Nick's point, both a sort of natural concrete as a sort of, you know, geological moment, but it also is a reconstituted vertical garden. And the idea is that those vertical columns of vegetation are reminiscent of the banyan tree, the ficus, and the idea that the kind of building, and I guess to the point of what would happen. I mean, the logic of this building, even though there's a building right next to it, Nicholas Grimshaw Science Museum, I don't think it can really expand much further. But one could imagine this thing sort of growing horizontally would be the sort of typology of growth that this building is proposing. And it's just kind of cut off where it is because there's a water there.
The banyan tree actually is an extraordinary tree in itself. I once had a discussion with Julian Vincent. Julian Vincent's one of the famous biomimetics guys. And what he found fascinating about it is it drops these tendrils down, so they're in tension, but then they take root and it shifts from tension to compression. So it's a really bizarre and fascinating model in terms of biological growth.
Yeah, and I think the banyan tree is not a native species, but the mangroves are, which are a similar kind of taproot structure. Yeah.
Can I just pick up on the question, because Jason was saying how Miami Beach actually has a fairly solid foundation. I was under the impression that obviously incorrect, that Miami Beach was completely artificial. Well, not completely artificial, but it was based on mangroves that had been there first of all, and it was infill. What was that comment, Jason, about the foundations and
the Atlantic Ridge is just that's when you look at the edge of the state of Florida. That's the Atlantic Ridge, which is this granite ridge, and Nick is on it more, but I believe sort of the eastern side of Miami Beach is the ridge is sort of there, but the back side of Miami Beach is, as you say, completely filled
artificial.
In, completely artificial, and obviously all the islands around it are artificial. But yeah, just below the surface there is this big granite shelf that is got the compressive strength of Manhattan, essentially. So as long as you hit it, there may be some muck before you get to the actual granite. It's once you hit it, you can build 40-50 stories of concrete structures without a problem.
I didn't know that, actually. Yeah, most of the footings, older homes might be on spread footings, but now predominantly they always do a soil bearing test, but predominantly they're on piles, concrete poured piles.
Right, because those are shallow, but yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So I don't know if we get any other questions coming in from from our team? Now's the chance to ask anything.
Incidentally, I'll just say that I also serve on the planning board of Miami Beach, and the zoning, speaking about what we admire about, the Perez and Stiltsville was not really permissible for a single family house until recently. If you were to elevate your home above the ground, they wanted you to fill it in with earth so that that was not really usable space below the house. And we've since changed a lot of the zoning so that you still have to go to a special public hearing. And a lot of neighbors don't want stilt homes in their neighborhoods for some reason. Preservationists don't want it. But now primarily through the example of Rene Gonzalez and a few other local architects, that's becoming more of a reality, which is a great model.
Can I just pitch in a question here? That is to say, everyone's kind of investing in Miami. We're getting this kind of very futuristic, kind of ambitious kind of investment in the future. But with sea level rise, I mean, Miami's going to be underwater soon. How do you explain that paradox that people are willing to invest in Miami despite the fact that it has maybe a limited shelf life before oceans rise? I mean, already, I should say, maybe those who don't have been to Miami, there are moments where there's a king tide or something. I mean, where Miami Beach is awash, and residents typically keep Wellington boots in the trunk, the boot of their cars, literally, because there's always a risk of flooding.
Yeah, I think, I mean, many people have talked about the vulnerability of Miami. And there's two. One is the natural vulnerability that you're talking about, that and I guess the sort of reaction to it is this idea of resilient urbanism, and Nick's point about, either buildings getting lifted up or the idea that the ground floor of a building is collapsible. The idea that if you have a storm surge, it goes through the building, and then after the storm washes away, you can kind of rebuild. But you wouldn't necessarily put all the sort of critical infrastructural components of a building, power, electrical vaults, on that first floor, and you would assume that it would kind of, move through given the storm. And I would say that is heightened, and part of the culture of Miami, which I've discussed with many people about our vulnerabilities. The hurricanes, the habitual event of the hurricane for Miami has made it a town always on the edge of disaster, reconciling disaster, and given the sort of the odd sort of storyline of Miami as it relates to the pandemic is all the sort of modalities that people have been undergoing right now to deal with the pandemic. Miami has a kind of culture of having to, sort of get ready for this surge because of the hurricanes, because hospital needs to understand you're going from X amount of people to having a surge of people being evacuated. All that kind of stuff, oddly enough, made us prepared, I think, in an odd way for that. I mean, other things aside, at least a culture of dealing with a kind of natural disaster is embedded in Miami. The other one is this sort of vulnerability to because of it being a developer town, the swings and arrows of the economy. When the economy is great, there's a lot to build, and then when it doesn't, Miami's the first to kind of slide off, layoffs, all the kind of stuff, and the architecture, at least us and our students, feel that immediately the second something turns. And in Miami, you can sort of do a history of the boom and busts. And talk about people's careers relative to that, because you go from lots of work to no work to whether your office exists past that to and you also have firms going from 300 people down to 10. That's also a Miami story. So it's a kind of interesting psychology. I'm sure other towns have that, but certainly our hurricane season, we get ready every year, and knock on wood, we skate through and get nothing, but there's always something that happens there. And I would say even that the sort of to Nick's comment about the fortified structure of Miami is tied to that thing. Our buildings are absurdly strong because of this reality, which is 150, 180 mile an hour winds whipping through your structure whenever that may happen. But oddly, the wind damage is important, and we had a couple of hurricanes before. We had a lot of damage on our skyscrapers, and the curtain walls were all tested to their engineered strength. But it actually is. It still remains. The flooding is probably the most damaging of the events tied to hurricanes. Though if you get the eye of a storm going through any area, very few things make it. So.
I get the impression though that Miami's now kind of establishing an identity of a kind of, or a brand, let's call it, that seems to be fairly solid now. I mean, I could see it now. It's defined what it is. Coming from LA, I kind of see it always in terms of kind of the little brother of LA, that it's kind of, many things are kind of similar in some ways, that slight otherworldliness of LA, where everyone speaks Spanish is the dominant language, and you get things like Gehry happening there. It's kind of a little bit like that, but at the same time, radically different. But at the same time, I think that Miami has got something which is now clearly identifiable, and I would have thought this got secured in terms of brand identity for the future. That's my impression.
Well, this is the big irony, right? Sea level is going to take us out. And this idea from Didion, you know, that it's the city's a mirage, it's a temporary city, you know, you're pouring your money in. And Miami Beach made this incredible sort of gamble. They said, oh, you know, we need the tax base to raise our streets and to fight sea level rise. And so we need lots of development so that we can pay for all of this. How does this end?
I will say, before I moved here, and I don't know if Gray was here for Hurricane Andrew, which was the last, I mean, we've had many storms in there, but the one that sort of defined Miami was Hurricane Andrew. Homestead was completely leveled, and building codes were completely changed. And I had visited Miami, the reason I came here was because of a classmate. I had visited, so essentially, I guess the summer or the fall after. So I saw a little bit of the kind of, you know, devastation to the landscape, and just sort of this city that was radically different. I mean, just an ugly place with all this sort of debris, none of the trees. And then I came back a year later, and it was as if nothing happened. Everything kind of bounced back, which I could not believe, because it felt like I was in a different place. I don't know, Gray, were you here for Andrew?
No, I wasn't.
Yeah. So, and people say that it is amazing. Like, and I've gone through a few hurricanes, and you walk out and the place is, you know, stuff everywhere. And then, you know, next year seems to be gone. So I don't know that we can do that too. Will away sea level rise. I don't think that would be quite the same thing, but it has this capacity. And again, because of the tropical environment, the sun and the humidity, certainly landscape won't mind. It'll adapt, and it'll bounce back, and does. So
yeah, I mean, my sort of fear, I suppose, is what happens when all the fancy people decide that Miami isn't cool anymore. So
you and me, Gray.
You and me, that's right, hanging in. But it, you know, riding this wave of development and popularity and art and so forth, you know, it's exhilarating, but it's kind of scary too.
Yeah, maybe I have one comment in relation with it, because I was thinking about our capacity as architects of negotiation all the time. And I was thinking also in this logic that you mentioned, like the hurricane logic, no, like this kind of idea of turbulence or something like that, that it seems that the logic, or at least I don't know if I'm enough permeable, or if I'm permeable enough of what you're saying about the logic of Miami, but it seems that you are going like, I don't know if it's an equilibrium or it's far from the equilibrium, but it's like in a way, one idea that you are going from the idea of extension of the landscape to the vertical points and repetition that you also have in the palms, or as Neil mentioned as well about the flamingo logic of vertical and horizontal in a way. And it seems that you are like in a continued negotiation between these logics, no? And in a way, the same idea of fluids in the economical terms or cultural terms, with this idea that you are going from the Latins to the Americans and to this idea of migration and movement and so on. It seems that it's a place which is in continued change, and maybe that's the logic, and it's just the logic of negotiation. So maybe you can substitute that way, just trying to see how we negotiate with all these realities, no? So just like one comment of what you're talking about.
I love that, the metaphor of the sort of fluidity, you know, and you think of the many different kinds of water, you know, fresh water, which is so precious and comes from the Everglades, and salt water from the ocean, and drinking water is another huge issue in Miami, and wastewater. And the sort of movement of those fluids underneath and alongside and intersecting with one another is you know, dynamic, and it's ever changing. But I also love this idea of sort of riding the wave, that it's, you know, it's precarious, and it does have that sort of exhilarating quality. So yeah, I mean, Miami as this kind of very thin sort of phenomenon, almost like a mirage hovering above the only slightly, ever so slightly above the water.
There's a question from the chat from Jorge Tabella. Let me just read it out to you. Miami's economy is largely based on tourism and was founded on that principle. But now Miami seems to be transforming into something more, especially with the most recent exodus of tech from California. Is this introduction of world-renowned architects focusing more on Miami a symptom of a new Miami economy being born, or just amplifying the touristic side of Miami? I mean, maybe I just add something to that, and that is to say, I think what I've noticed just recently as a result of COVID, that people have begun to realize that actually, once you can start working remotely, my comments would be that not that place doesn't matter. It means the opposite. Place is absolutely vitally important. And what we're discovering is apparently in Hawaii, there's been a huge influx of people, remote working, but living in Hawaii, because if you're going to work anywhere, why not work in Hawaii? We've also seen actually in Miami Beach, Venice Beach. I'm based in Venice Beach and work in Miami Beach. These are the two coolest places in the States, apparently. But Venice Beach was recently has been colonized by tech in a kind of similar way, moving down from San Francisco, and it's always been a nuisance actually. So Venice Beach has become Silicon Beach, and I often thought that maybe Miami Beach is potentially going to become another Silicon Beach from that point of view. We have, well, Magic Leap is not doing so well, but Magic Leap is just in Fort Lauderdale. But I think there's a huge potential for the wealth that is coming increasingly from tech companies to move into Miami itself.
Yeah, in the newspaper this morning, in fact, the city of Miami has developed a fund. I think it's $100 million or something like that, for investment into tech companies that will that are either here or will be coming here. So yes, indeed. And this idea, yes, this idea that once you have the freedom to move, yes, indeed, you can.
Yeah, I get it, just a sort of crass term, but it was always referred to as a chamber of commerce day. So blue skies, 60s, nice breeze. You can hear the dollar bills just getting produced. So that's always been the kind of Miami credo that, it is, I mean, to your point, there's this kind of, it's for the sort of uber rich, there's a, migratory patterns, an odd connection between Miami and Aspen, Colorado. So if you're in that sort of milieu, that is, to your point, entirely about place, entirely about sort of phenomenology, about the tactile quality of the land, the air, the temperatures, all that kind of stuff. It is absolutely not virtual. It is profoundly real. And it's a bunch of people that are, clearly, going out of their way to get the sort of the best version of whatever they feel is ideal. But it is nothing abstract about that. And I've heard many times that Miami's winter, it rivals Colorado's summers. You can pick, which one is more spectacular. But they have become a pair, oddly enough. I don't know, oddly enough, but certainly that's there's a little pipeline there.
Mm-hmm. Theodorus, do you want?
Yeah,
go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No.
It just brings it to the role of architecture in a virtual world. That because architecture is not virtual, that it has a particularly grounding effect, and is in fact, and that physicality of it is in fact enhanced by the virtual. Anyway, Theodorus.
I think he's under the weather. So, but I'll read out his comment. The choice of tech companies is curious. I think that maybe underestimating the impact of climate change. True. Although I do hope they provide a stimulus to technologies that can help mitigate its impacts. And let's not forget that some of these technologies do use up. I mean, I think the AI especially is guilty of this. And I once heard every single Google's search use up enough energy to boil a cup of tea, to make a cup of tea. I mean, so let's hope they do something. Unless we've got any further comments, maybe we should sort of wrap things up. What I want to say is actually this has been. I mean, we've had 2 sessions already. We've had in Mar-a-Lago, which itself is extraordinary in many ways, and somehow kind of relates to this. I know it's in Palm Beach, it's further north, but still it's kind of related in some senses to things going on, and especially as some of the Trump family are moving into Miami itself. And then they're here, exactly. Last week, the session on Zaha, which I think actually set the scene perfectly for all this and also, but I think for the rest of the series, because I think what the idea behind this series, Miami, Do You Love Me? And just to say for those of you who don't realize, Miami is Italian for "you love me." So this is about this kind of picking up on this rather sort of exotic nature, shall we say. And of course, it's people like Gianni Versace who came to live in Miami. And there's a huge Italian community actually in Miami Beach, especially over the winter. But I think what this session did was really lay out some of the interesting kind of thematic issues that are going to inform things. The extraordinary nature of the biology. I mean, I think the banyan tree, the Everglades that were mentioned. I mean, this is something really sort of curious, and that there is part of that is what makes Miami so special is the ecology. And next week we'll be going to looking at Colin Ford from Coral Morphological coming, which I think will be a really special session because their work is spectacular. Colin Ford is a marine biologist, and he collaborates with artists with this practice called Coral Morphological, which is really, really extraordinary. It can only almost happen in Miami, but it's a very, very special thing. But it also kind of set the scene for the Everglades thing, which is a unique and very weird environment with some very weird creatures in there. And of course, we had the flamingos and things mentioned and so on. And I think this is kind of like what the course is trying to do is to try and draw out that very extraordinary and bizarre and exotic nature of something about Miami, certainly in terms of the kind of the imagination of many people from outside. That's what makes it such a special place. That's what brought Zaha in the first place to Miami. And also, I think what was interesting today was the whole sort of the emphasis on real estate, and because that is really part of it also, because one of the comments Zaha made is that she could just walk outside her building and bump into potential clients. And she did, of course. And that, we saw last week what the result of that was. So I think, hopefully there are a lot of sort of thematic issues here. And Stiltsville, I think Stiltsville is just absolutely extraordinary. And the cocaine cowboy thing as well. There are some actually, the UK, I want to say, we love this idea of kind of pirates. It's kind of very romantic, you know, that's what they are, they're pirates. But we have, you know, Gilbert and Sullivan made an opera about pirates of Penzance. We kind of love this idea of this. So it has this exotic but rather seedy edge to things. And all behind it is money, you know, and I think this is one of the key things that we shouldn't, architects often overlook, but it is about money. And I think the investment in Miami through the kind of the whatever it is, the kind of the slightly dodgy funding that's going into the place, but it's the engine of what makes Miami happen. And I think that hopefully we'll see more of this kind of drawing out this exotic flamingo-like, Christo-like sort of world of Stiltsville during the rest of the course, because I think this has been a fabulous contribution. I have to say that I should have known more about Miami. I found out an awful lot today, so I want to thank Nick and Jason for their extraordinary contributions. And I think that it's also set the scene, frankly, for the visits we'll be having to Miami on this program. Which I mean, I think you've made us all the more kind of wishing that we could be there next month. I mean, as had been intended, to have this sort of 1 week where we're kind of parachuting in like people do, like snowbirds do. So I think, well, hopefully you've whetted our appetite, shall we say. I think we look even more forward to the possibility of experiencing and visiting some of these buildings in the flesh, as it were, because I think this has been extraordinary. So unless there are any more questions from the audience, I think we can wrap up. I would just say that to follow up from this, we have on Sunday there's a session on the AI, the history and future of AI is going to be the session that I'm going to be hosting, shall we say, on Sunday. And next week for this Friday session, we have, as I mentioned, Colin Ford coming in and talking about choral morphologic. Really interesting session. I know because I've engaged with him, and also Eric Goldenberg. We're talking a little bit about his involvement and collaboration with Colin Ford and choral morphologic. And I think that it's going to be that itself. I think is emblematic of everything because of the extraordinary rich. What goes beyond underneath in the water is quite amazing, but it's also symptomatic of some of the issues that we face, you know, climate change, global warming, the corals being bleached and so on. I know that Anna, who's in Australia right now, is certainly, that's one of the concerns, I think, in the Great Barrier Reef about the destruction of coral around the world. So I invite you all to come back next week to, I think, what will be a very interesting session with Colin Ford. So thank you once again, Jason and Nick. That was fabulous. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
A
you.
pleasure to do it. Nice to talk to everyone.